The good news and the bad news is that everything that is in your life, whether you like it or not, is a consequence of a choice you've made. It might have been subconsciously, it might have been willingly or unwillingly, but you are exactly where you are right now because you chose through a series of 1,000 little steps to make choices that led you right here, right now. And the same way you got here, you can make different choices that will get you somewhere else.
Well, hello, dear Business as Poetry listener. Today's guest knows what it means to perform at the highest level and to finally understand why you're doing it. Tamsyn Signe spent nearly 2 decades in senior retail leadership in South Africa, built and sold a successful business, competed in wingsuit acrobatics at world championship level, and became a professional freediving safety diver. But it's what she does now that I find most compelling because she uses the Enneagrams to help people understand the deeper patterns driving their behavior, their choices, and their performance. Because knowing what you're capable of is one thing, but knowing why you do what you do, that's where the real work begins. Welcome, Tam. How are you this morning?
Thank you, Christina. It's great to be with you today.
Excellent. Well, I'm so glad you managed to find a little bit of time because, as I mentioned in my intro, and our guests would have picked up, you are quite busy. You are a very active person, and I said it in the warm up, and I'll say it again. I invite women from multifaceted interests, careers, etc. But I don't think I've ever had anyone quite as diverse in their interests as you are. So I think it's going to be a delight to have this interview. But maybe I will start right at the beginning, right where your career started. And that was, I think, more than 2 decades ago. You ended up in retail, but it almost sounded like you ended up a little bit by chance. And then one step at a time, this led you to where you are today. So maybe let's start there.
Perfect. I was the classic retail mistake. When we were at school and you had those career days where they'd bring in the universities and the guidance counselors and all of those good things, they gave you a great list of selections which said you can be an architect or you can be a teacher or you can be a doctor or you can be any of these good things. No one walked in and said retail is a great career and there are all these opportunities. And through my decades in retail, I never met anyone else who woke up and was led into that path. So through a series of coincidences, as a newly divorced single mother with 2 young kids, doing my MBA part-time while working 2 other jobs, I, through a fortuitous series of events, met my first retail boss as part of my MBA study group. And he coerced me to move cities, change jobs, change careers, and do a complete switch into a new direction that I'd never considered an option before. Now, the driving force for that was way more mundane and practical than it sounds. I had 2 young kids, I had bills to pay, and my personal P&L wasn't making sense. What was coming in wasn't matching what was going out. So I packed up my life and my kids, moved to the city, and jumped onto the retail treadmill. It was a baptism of fire because it was a very steep learning curve coming into very competitive teams who were all highly skilled and very much a sink or swim environment. Retail is always on, and you don't really get to take your time in it and immerse slowly and see how it makes you feel. It's very cerebral, it's very action-oriented, and in the merchandise area I got into, it's decisions. Just make things happen. And you're always wrong. It's either too much stock, too little stock, too early, too late. The promotion's too successful. It didn't work well enough. So it's an incredibly high-pressured environment. But that taught me a massive amount about resilience and pushing through in situations where you might not want to, but there are a series of decisions that have led you to that point and you need to make a success of it. I worked through a series of promotions relatively quickly and got asked to become the executive at one of the sister companies in the group I was working for at the time. And when I arrived as a new member of the executive team, there were 3 of us who had started, and we got sent off to an executive coach for assessments, as they do. And they did the evaluations, and I scored really, really well on almost all of the metrics. I outperformed everything except one. And this coach sat me down and he said, "Do you know what you scored on the people index?" And I said, "Well, no." And he said, "Zero. Zero, Tamsyn. Zero. Zero people skill."
Is that even
Which
possible? I thought you'd have at least one.
I know it seems ludicrous given the work I do now, but he said to
Mhm.
me, "You're at a crossroads. You have technical genius, but the world is made up of people, and unless you learn to interface with them and understand them and work with them, your career is going to plateau here." And he said, "You have a choice. You don't have to do it. You've got to where you are. But in order to have something you've never had, you're going to have to do something you've never done. And that's going to be to indulge the humanness of life." And as a technical person, the idea sounded completely horrific.
What was that
But
what was that going to entail? What does that mean to engage the human? How did that work?
well, at that point, I had no idea because everything was spreadsheets and right or wrong or deadline and do it my way or get it done and deliver the results and, make the maths make sense.
Mm.
I hadn't yet at that point in my late 20s, early 30s figured out that behind every spreadsheet is a human. They are motivated by emotion and experience and their own desire for significance. And you can drive them really hard, but they're not a machine. And once you learn to work with them and understand what makes them tick and give them the space to be the beautiful human they are and to step up and create opportunity for them, actually everything else becomes a whole lot easier. So
Yeah.
that was a
I actually wanted
pivotal experience in that retail space that really changed my trajectory.
I actually wanted to jump in because I think that's such a common pattern that we see with so many women who come from corporate, that there's this almost robotic built-in desire to succeed, to produce, to get, you said it, you named it, you get things done. And there's almost a
Mhm.
certain pride attached to it, right? And
Yeah.
that's how we were raised. Or, and I think that probably still continues to a great extent in many environments. So to me, it would be super interesting to find out then what happened, because you mentioned that was the crossroad, the turning point. So clearly, to get to where you are now, coaching others, you must have worked on those people skills. So how did that happen, and what was the challenge for you?
I did. It involved having a coach of my own, in fact, 2 different coaches that I worked with over time. But the learning started with learning to accept myself as a human being and not being so hard on myself. Because when you're in a situation as a single mother who's changed careers and you have a certain set of imperatives you have to meet, and you're juggling all these things, you often don't leave space for yourself. And as humans, we have a desire for significance. We want to make a difference. Like, why are we here? What is motivating us? And coming home to myself was part of that journey. And learning to differentiate, Tamsin is the professional person and that persona that delivers the results, from Tamsin the human, was quite a journey. And the biggest challenge on that journey came when I was working with a wonderful coach who was incredible. He was a lovely human. But his challenge to me was around living my life in these little boxes where there was the work Tamsin, and everyone knew, always perfectly groomed, perfectly dressed, well spoken, intelligent, got the job done, and so on and so forth. No one had any idea what I did with my personal life and on the weekends. And at that time, I was training with my wingsuit team to represent South Africa at the first wingsuit acrobatics world championship in Florida that December.
I think
And
we maybe need to open a bracket here and tell, for those who might not know, what is wingsuit acrobatics, because it's not something that you see every day. And suddenly, I've never done it. I can tell you that much.
no,
With
it's
my fear
not.
of heights, probably not a good idea. Yeah.
Oh, I'm terrified of heights. I get vertigo on an escalator. But when the ground's
Okay.
far away, it's fine.
Ah,
So
okay. Tell me
w-
more.
wingsuit acrobatics in the competitive sense involves skydiving out of a not always so perfectly good aeroplane, where you exit with your wingsuit on and you fall into glorious open space below you. The team consists of two competitors and a camera flyer. Now you're flying in your suits, flying next to each other, doing barrel rolls and tumbles and all sorts of coordinated choreographed maneuvers, while the third person is flying in close proximity, filming all of this. At the end of that, you open your parachute as normal and come down and land. So there's often confusion between wingsuit base jumpers and wingsuiters who are skydivers. Wingsuit base jumpers are those who you see on the Red Bull teams and on social media,
We
jumping
call
off
them the flying
mountains,
squirrels
flying
with
through
those
the
things.
trees. Exactly. We use the same suits, but the environment we operate in is different.
Mhm.
So, a very high risk, high reward sport, but it teaches you a lot about presence and being in the moment and risk management and a lot of the skills that have translated into my coaching practice. So, in brackets, training for Wingsuit World Championships with my team, which was all consuming on the weekends. And my coach invited me to start opening the little boxes of my life and allow the work people to see more of the whole Tam and what happened on the weekend. And to shock and horror, allow my friends on the weekend people to realize there was this alter ego that actually went to an office on a Monday morning. And I found that process quite challenging because there's a vulnerability in revealing yourself, right? So I started sharing with one or two of my colleagues and then my boss. So I was like, I need to take, 2 weeks leave in November, which is the worst possible time in retail, let me tell you, just ahead of Christmas
Oh.
rush. And I started sharing this experience with people, and their response blew me away because not only was there this acceptance of something different, but there was this curiosity and excitement and support that came through. But most importantly, it gave people the safe space to start sharing their own stories. And I realized that I was surrounded by all these incredible people who also had alter egos and different lives and things they were doing. And it created an opportunity for connection and shared experience. So, what started as an incredibly heavy blow to the ego of you have zero people skill, which sounds like complete failure to a high performer, translated into the beginning of a journey of understanding the people. And I started applying that to people in my team. I started hiring people for their attitude and less for skill. And I started backing them. I trained them up and I would say, you're on my team. I trust you to make this decision and I'm going to back you even if you get it wrong. But you have the safety to do the best work that you can, however you see fit. And by starting to create those learning experiences for people, I realized that actually having human skill made my job a lot easier. And I ended up with a cool group of people who I employed and moved around with me through my career.
Well, we've touched on so many things there. I think that, number one, vulnerability, which I think was a
Mm,
big and always is a big learning process for anyone starting to do human work or human to human or people work because as you said, nobody likes robots. And I've even heard one extreme that popped into my head as I was listening to you, which was about somebody who we were talking about communication skills, and he said, "Oh yeah, I've just had a baby, but nobody on my team even knows that." That
wow.
kind of an obvious thing. How much he was holding within and didn't see the need. A bit like what you said. Oh, I'm X person at work, and then I have this little compartment which is my personal life. And for me, it also sounded like by doing that, you created the safety within the team, because people trusted you because they could see your own vulnerability. Maybe they could see more of you within them, and vice versa. And it was also interesting when you were talking about little boxes because, and we'll get to that in a second when we look at something like the Enneagrams and you explain to
Mm,
us what that means. some people might be quick to jump to a conclusion that that's also, oh, it's another one of those personality tests. It just puts me in like a little box. I'm this, or I'm that, and therefore that gives you the complete
Mhm.
picture.
Yes. Now, you've touched on something really important there is what we see of people is the behavior. As we engage and as we go about our personal lives and our work, the way people are, so how you are being, the way you think, the way you speak, and the way you feel and show up in the world might not be aligned with what is motivating you to do that. Your behavior is the piece of the iceberg, if we use the iceberg analogy, that sits above the water. But the part below the water is the motivation of why you do what you do. It's all of those psychodynamic factors. It's your historical conditioning, your formative experiences that have taught you how to show up in the world and how to create safety for yourself. While we're growing up, we learn through our experiences and our mentors and our caregivers that if I behave like this, I get a successful outcome. I get praise, I get reward, I get my needs met. If I behave like that, there's a negative consequence, and therefore this is not the right way to show up. So people's motivational drives are heavily influenced by those early experiences. And those motivations are what create the 9 Enneagram types. So what's motivating someone and how they behave might be completely different.
Yes, well, it's good that you made a pause there because I started thinking, and I was almost daydreaming about what were my early experiences like? What would have shaped me? And you and I spoke, and that's I'm taking a huge interest in human psychology and behavioral psychology. So any personality test that you can throw my way, I love that. But again, I think with time I've learned to see the nuances between just being too prescriptive. And that's why I was really interested when we had that first conversation because there's so many tools being thrown out there, and people sometimes well meaningly, but without necessarily having the experience with the depth, start interpreting things, usually with the help of AI, which is not particularly helpful, rather than using a trained coach or psychologist
Yes.
or whatever it may be. And they start making these assumptions, whether it's human design, which, I find very fascinating, but it took me a long time to actually learn how to use it properly rather than just prescriptively. Um, Whether it's astrology, because again, that puts you in types, whether it's the kind of Jungian kind of personality test, the four polarities. It's always four. I don't know why. It always has to be an even number. But it sounds like in yours, there's 9 of those. Um, what can you tell us about? What can you tell someone who's just hearing about this for the first time and they're thinking maybe that sounds interesting, but what's the it's all a lot of theory. It's all great. I'm type 1, 2, 3, 4, but what does that actually mean, and how can I use this in my work to actually benefit from that knowledge rather than just being another thing that I put nicely to the side? Yes, I've done the test, and that's it.
The best way to describe it is to tell you how I felt when I first got the results of mine. It was like having a piece of technological equipment that you've been pressing buttons on and randomly get to work sometimes but don't understand. And then suddenly someone gives you the operating manual and you decide to read it. It is like getting your own human operating manual that explains why you do what you do. So for me, I'm a type 7, which is an enthusiastic visionary. And anyone who's had any experience with the Enneagram at this point will be laughing and saying, well, that was completely obvious. And I tell you why. Type 7s are driven by a motivation to have all the experiences, do all the things. They're very future forward. They have the worst possible FOMO. They're always full of big ideas. They actualize some, not others. They're always off on adventures and looking for new experiences. They are completely allergic to pain and boredom and admin and all of those sorts of things. So sitting and doing routine things over and over again is complete death for a type 7. Now, underlying that is this anxiety where I'm not getting to my admin, but if I'm doing my admin, then it takes away from my possibility of having all these experiences. And there's that anxiety that comes with it. So learning to integrate that and work with it is part of the work. But knowing all of those things about myself and knowing how the different pieces work really gives me tools to transform my own life. So as a type 7, wanting to have all these experiences and all of that, the biggest path of transformation is through what we call the line of stretch. And each type has a specific other type that they learn to lean into. To take a step back for a moment, we are never definitively just one type. We all have a proportion of all of the 9 types inside of us, and it's like a recipe. Some might have a bit more of one and a bit less of the other. And the more integrated a person becomes, the more difficult they are to type because they learn to move easily between all of the 9 types and develop those skills and behaviors associated with all of them as they become a more integrated human being. But part of that journey is learning to exchange hats. And this is how I describe it to clients. My type 7 hat is the hat I'll wake up with every morning. It's my everyday wearer. I wake up, it goes on, I walk out the door, I face the world. That is the filter and the lens through which I approach life. However, as I develop self-awareness, I can learn to say, in this situation, wearing this hat is not serving me. How can I show up differently to give myself a different result? And the most difficult one for a type 7 is to take off the type 7 hat and put on the type 1 hat. Now, you ask, what is the type 1? The type 1 is the strict perfectionist. They are concerned with system, order, everything needs to be done correctly. They can come across as a bit judgy because everything has to be right and everything's not quite good enough. And they're the hardest on themselves. Their personal quality control sits above the standard they would exert on anyone else. Now, you can't get further from a type 7 than that. But if you learn to integrate those facets, you can transform your own life. So for me, learning to take that on board involved sitting down and saying, right, instead of running off on the next adventure and booking the next diving trip, let's have an annual plan and a monthly plan and a weekly review. What are my priorities for the week? What do I need to get done? How does this fit in? And at the end of the week, having an honest review with myself saying, did I do for myself what I said I was going to do, or did I get distracted? Now, there's this life design thing that comes in, and you can set yourself up for success or failure, right? So I can take that type 1 whip and crack it over my type 7 self and set up a week. And then I wake up on Tuesday and the weather's great and it's perfect for a surf. Now what do I do? Well, I've reverse engineered that. So my Sunday review involves sitting down, and step 1 in the weekly planning is setting myself up for success by checking the weather forecast first. So the first thing I do is check what's happening on the days in the week. And then I schedule the weather-related activities. So Tuesday might be a surf, Thursday might be a dive, Friday might be a hike. And then I schedule everything else around that to make sure that it still gets done and I don't lose reality through this pursuit of constant pleasure that can become a type 7 problem. So this is where it becomes really practically useful, where I'm saying to myself, okay, it's time for the type 1 hat. Let's sit down and be a grown-up. Let's do this. And then you can run off and be your type 7 best self again.
Oh, well, as I was listening, I thought I'm probably almost the reverse of what you are, with me being leaning a lot more heavily either through conditioning or design, who knows, into type 1, almost thinking, oh, maybe I should get a bit more into type 7. So especially if it works like opposites. But to me, there was something that really was burning to ask you as you were speaking, and I think you gave the answer partially. It was about, how do we make sure that, yes, we integrate the opposite of who we naturally are drawn to be, but without this becoming like just another forced, intervention or something that, as you say, is a bore, or, how does one make this sustainable? Because I know lots of, again, well-meaning people who are like, oh, I'm going to be a bit more and I'm going to do my admin and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And then they're like, oh, that just goes so much against me that something just doesn't feel aligned.
Yes. So when you're leaning into the transformational space, there are times when that's appropriate and there are times when it's not. Now, people might be in a state of very high stress and strain. And with a client, that's the first place I start, is looking at their current strain profile. If someone is under a lot of pressure and their life is a pressure cooker, pushing them to a line of transformation is not appropriate. Their bandwidth is full. That is all they can handle. They just do not need that level of pressure anymore. Now, this is the beauty of the Enneagram, is it gives you different tools. If someone is in a boredom space and where they're not stimulated and they've got room for growth, then pushing them to create transformation and stretching them is an appropriate, slow, step-by-step process. And you do it in ways that are small and easy to integrate, not this overwhelming, you need to now be someone completely different.
Mhm.
That completely defeats the point of being your unique, beautiful self, right? And in the tool, then we would move to the line of release, because there are other characteristics that work like the valve on the pressure cooker that would help you to blow off steam and to relieve some of the pressure that might be created by your current environment or the state you're in, or some of your behaviors you're exhibiting without realizing it. Now, let me give you again the type 7 example. Type 7s are prone to jump ahead. Because they're having all these experiences, they don't go deep and they don't become experts in an area. And there's this risk of developing expertise and getting ahead of yourself, or perceived expertise that is not backed up by truly doing the work. So for a type 7, the line of release is the quiet specialist, where you go back to the type 5 and you go inward and you do your research and you do your homework, because that relieves some of that performance anxiety and it grounds you a whole lot. It's a lot easier to do than to be strict on yourself and apply schedules. If I give you a description of the type 5, they're very inward, they're very cerebral, and they're driven by a desire to understand how the world works and to be experts. They also have a desire to conserve resources. So there's this potential hoarding, whether it's emotional energy, whether it's physical resources, whether it's time and space. So to trigger a type 5, you take away their resources, or you put them under pressure for an emotional response, or you act in
Mhm.
a non-methodical way. Now, when you coach a type 7 to lean into their line of release and go into the type 5 space, that involves getting away from all this excitement of this big futuristic, we're going to do all these amazing things and have these experiences, into let me retreat and let me investigate and let me seek to learn and understand. And that brings a completely different energy, where suddenly that anxiety of always pushing ahead and having all of these experiences gets mitigated by a quiet authority that comes from deeper learning. And for me, I've worked with that with myself, moving into my practice, where I'm now doing further study on breathwork for resilience and all sorts of other modalities, nervous system regulation, that help to support a fuller experience of bringing someone into the coaching space by integrating breathing, somatics, emotional experience. Because as humans, we're a whole human being. We're not just, this little box with a label where you can tick a few
Mhm.
things and move on. And the more you understand of all of that, the better.
So maybe I was wondering, because I know people, when they listen to these things, we're prone to be thinking, what am I? Who am I?
Mm,
You hear about a
mm,
methodology or archetypes and you want to know who you are. Obviously, I
mm,
do as well. And we'll probably follow up after this call to find
mm.
out. But maybe I know, conscious of time as well, but maybe with one or two lines, if you can give us just a quick overview, the sneak peek of what these 9 types are, maybe how they relate to one another. And again, if in your practice as a coach and as a team leader as well, you've observed certain patterns that are much more common for those coming, let's say, from the corporate world, because I think a big part of the people listening to this come from this. They either had a corporate job, or maybe they're just looking for some kind of transformation, something that helps them through their work to express more fully who they are and get to the bottom of this. And as you and I know, the road ahead is always through self knowledge, getting comfortable with who you are and expressing. So that's why I think from that lens, it might be interesting to hear and see if people recognize themselves in these 9 types. Now, what you just heard was a taste of what Tamsyn does in her coaching work. And honestly, we could have kept going for another hour. But if you want the full Enneagram deep dive with all 9 types, how they show up in corporate, and what you could do with that information, that's exclusively for Business Poetry subscribers on Substack. It's free to join, and the link is in the show notes below, or you can go to businessespoetry.substack.com. Now, let's keep going. Back to Tamsyn. I know that you get, because I can see how much you care about this. And I think it's, I didn't want to stop because I think it's nice to give the whole picture, because again, when we stay at the surface level, it often misses some very important detail, and people never get the depth. And I think with you, we get so much depth. But also, as I was listening to those, I was first of all imagining specific people, either in the family, or in my corporate environment, or wherever it may be, which is always quite funny because you're like, oh, I know who you're talking about. But equally, I was thinking about me, and maybe that's the beauty of, or the challenge of assessing yourself. And that's why usually you need somebody on the outside to give you back that mirror. Is that, oh, I'm all of them. I'm all of them. And, almost maybe with 1 or 2 exceptions. And I think where you might be using this, if you're listening to this for the first time, is not just assessing or getting to know yourself, but actually how to work with those people, understanding where they're coming from as opposed to clashing. And that clashes happens a lot, as you said, between specific types. But maybe putting the types aside, I want to go back and refocus a little bit on your journey. We're nearing almost at the end of the conversation, but to me, if I was to wrap up with one final question or thought or observation, it will be more about you. Now that you've gotten to know yourself, you have the framework, you are coaching others. What was most fascinating to me in your story is that you've built a life that is curated for yourself. And I hear it, and my heart sings every time I hear someone, oh yeah, that's not possible for me, or not with my job, and not with this, and not with that. Yeah, that's good for her, but not for me. So maybe if you can use your own experience, what would you tell these people, and how can anyone take something away from your story and be like, you know what, whether I know which type I am or not, how can I build a life, a bit like what you were saying, one decision away from change that actually works for me, rather than me being the victim of the circumstances and the external environment dictating how my life should be.
Christina, I love that you've used the word curation, because that's been a golden thread for me through my personal work the last 2 years. And I'm actually building a retreat series around that. And a lot of the personal transformational work I do, so not in the corporate space, is around that life curation. I actually run a 1-year program where curating your life is the outcome of that. Now, to do that, I see it as a 3-step thing. And it starts with knowing yourself. You need to submerge. You need to go into your inner world. You need to understand, how does this messy human being work? What is my significance? What do I desire? And being brave enough to take off the blinkers and go, what are the things I truly, truly want and dream of? And not limiting yourself and saying, oh, I can't have it, or so on. Like, what does your heart really desire? Then understanding, how does this tool work? Which levers do I pull for which results? And when I press that big red button and then it explodes here, why is that happening? Because we do not live in isolation. We live in community and connection. So once we understand ourselves, we can understand how we are relating to others and our environments. And how are we being? How are we showing up? And how is that shaping the reality that we're creating for ourselves? The good news and the bad news is that everything that is in your life, whether you like it or not, is a consequence of a choice you've made. It might have been subconsciously, it might have been willingly or unwillingly, but you are exactly where you are right now because you chose through a series of 1,000 little steps to make choices that led you right here, right now. And the same way you got here, you can make different choices that will get you somewhere else. Now, the secret sauce with curation, and I've seen without exception with my clients, is we think we need to add more tools, more experiences, more skills, more this, more that. But if you are brave enough to want radical change, it starts with creating space. So once you understand yourself and you're relating, it's having a hard look at your life and going, what are the things I've brought into my life that no longer serve me? And looking at it through the lens of your type. Let's say you're a type 6 and you've created all of these resources or built up collections to create a perceived sense of safety. Maybe you've got 2 or 3 homes or, extra just in case. Those things take up energy. They take maintenance, they take finance. And part of that process is going, if I believe I am safe, do I need all these backup plans? Or can I be brave enough to release it, which then creates space and resources that I could reinvest in creating and curating my ideal life? The stripping away is the scary part, having that self-trust to create the space in your life where there is room for change. If your cup is already full and mostly full of things that aren't serving you, there isn't space for this expression of what you need and what you want to create. So step 1 is creating the space and the canvas for that beautiful reality to be curated of what you really want. And that's the part people are scared of. But on the other side of fear is this beautiful, beautiful experience of waking up in the morning and going, wow, this is actually my life. I created this for myself.
Well, I know you have that feeling every day, or almost every day. Let's be honest here. But I think it does come down to choice, and I know many people like to imagine that they don't have a choice, but that's rarely the case. I always think back to what one of my teachers said. She said, if you imagine your life as a path that you're going just straight ahead, even if you turn a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left, you end up in a completely different place. And I think that probably sums up the essence of what you said. And
Yes.
another favorite thing of mine, which was just creating space. You can't keep adding things and then not removing anything and then wondering why you want to break down and cry every night when you got home because you're exhausted emotionally, mentally, physically, in all ways, shapes, and forms. But just to wrap up the interview, because I think this was by far one of the most interesting conversations that we've had, and we can carry on forever, and we probably will offline. If anyone wanted to find out more about your work or what's next, you mentioned some retreats. Where can they find you and how?
They can find me at this point on my email address, info@tamsynsigne.com, TAMSYNSIGNE.com. I am, in true Type 7 form, busy building my website while doing the work, and that is performancealchemy.co.za. My coaching business is called Performance Alchemy because there's a whole lot of magic in there, and we work in the peak performance space mostly. So you can find me online there. Otherwise on social, Tam Needs Water on Instagram, tam.needs.water, and on LinkedIn under Tamsyn Signe.
Yes, and I'll put, if you are listening to this as a podcast, you'll find the links in the show notes. And if you are watching, then in the comments. And then equally an invitation from me to make sure that you don't miss the next episodes. There's some very exciting changes coming up for Business is Poetry. And a lot of it is related to the topics that we had today that we do keep evolving. And as I get to know myself and my business DNA better, changes are happening. And I always say change is a good thing. It's not a failure, as you said. It's more a building block towards something. And I would probably recommend that you definitely follow the link below and subscribe on Substack, because that's where a lot of the change will be happening. And you may be surprised to find out that the podcast is also moving its home as well. And a lot of these beautiful in-depth conversations, I really feel that the place for them it's just somewhere else, somewhere where people have the depth and the time and the desire to get into the woods with me and with my guests. So make sure that you stay tuned and subscribe on Substack. But once again, thank you so much, Tam. I know we're going to carry on for a long time. We could have carried on, but it was just so beautiful to get your perspective. Thank you again, and have a lovely rest of the day. Probably going surfing, aren't you?
Christina, thank you so much for having me on the show, but also for the work you do in creating the space for these conversations to happen. It's beautiful to see the world evolving and for people being brave enough to doing exactly what you're doing, stepping out there and doing something different in that desire for significance. So thank you for creating that space. And yes, we'll definitely carry on chatting.